implement it. It won't succeed. They should go back to the drawing board.
I call Materia Toure.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. While it's good to have seen the government made some changes to this legislation from their original review and proposal, we are nonetheless opposing this bill because we think that it is going to cause significant harm to families and to children, and particularly to vulnerable women who are in situations of family violence. We're looking forward to seeing what changes might be made at the Select Committee and in the committee stages of this bill, and we certainly make no commitment beyond the first reading because this legislation is going to harm our people, not help. This is because the safety of women and children is being placed at even further risk. The reforms, as been set out so well by the Honourable Phil Goff, shows that they are strongly focused on saving money, much less focused on saving women and children from the risk of violence. There is an obsessive user pays ideology that pervades these reforms, and of course that is what will hurt these families. Not a single thing that the National Party has said about this bill justifies the extreme increase in costs. Not a single thing about children, about families, about simplified process. None of that justifies the extreme cost. One thing that we agree that, with this bill is the decision to make economic abuse part of the definition of domestic abuse. We agree with that change. It should be part of it. Economic abuse, economic control by one partner over another does cause serious harm, particularly to a protective parent in a family environment and to any children in that relationship. A person who is without financial resources is highly vulnerable, is trapped in a dangerous relationship and is locked out from the support services that they may need. So it is therefore quite ironic to see that in this bill, that same level of economic abuse against vulnerable women and children is now being played out by the national government through this legislation, because the new cost structure imposed by this bill is a form of economic abuse, in my view, against those people who need this system the most. You place a barrier of $1,000 as an entry barrier to accessing support, dispute resolution for vulnerable families. That is a form of economic abuse against those most vulnerable people. This bill could have been much better. It could have been much more responsive to the needs of families and children. It could have met the principles that the national government says they wanted to set out, but instead it is imposing massive new costs and will lock people out from justice. As has been said, the new compulsory family dispute resolution process will cost around $1,000. There's a $220 filing fee, and there's also additional costs to a family, to parents, as they go through the process. For example, the payment for psychological reports or for specialist report writers will be imposed on the parents, on the families going through this process. The court will also decide whether to charge the parents for the cost of the lawyer for the child. Now, these last two costs around report writers and lawyers for the child, they could be charged under the existing system, but they seldom were, because the burden, the inference was that these are services that should be supplied to families and to children where they are needed. But now they will be imposed unless the family can make a case for serious hardship. And there's no real evidence as to what criteria might be applied, how that process might work. All of that is being dealt with elsewhere, not necessarily through this legislation. Now, if you add up all of the expected costs that will now be imposed on families and children during a very stressful and difficult time in their lives, we're talking somewhere around $5,000 for a family to go through the compulsory FDR process. $5,000. Families simply cannot afford that. Now, I understand from what the Minister has said previously that legal aid will be available in some cases to those on very low incomes. But as the Honourable Phil Goff said, those on low and medium incomes simply will not be able to afford it. They won't be eligible for legal aid. and they won't be able to afford something between $1,000 and $5,000 just for those initial costs of going through the compulsory process. I guess it's just that maybe people in the National Party just don't understand what it's like for an ordinary family to live an ordinary life. Maybe they don't understand how much money $1,000 is to a family who's on the minimum wage or to a family who's on the median income. When a family breaks up and one of the partners has to go and set up a new household and make sure that they've got a big enough household so that their kids can come and sleep there in the weekends, and wants to set up a decent family home so that in that family you now have to have two good quality, decent family homes to take care of your kids in the way that you want to. The costs of that process alone can be extraordinary. But then to have these additional costs imposed by government for no reason, for no justification, it doesn't help the children to charge a family $1,000, doesn't help the vulnerable mother to charge her $1,000 for this process. It is simply a cost recovery process by this government, by people who don't understand what it's like to live an ordinary life. But of course, cost is just one of the major concerns that we have about this bill. The new family dispute resolution process could be a good thing for some families, but certainly not for all. It will be compulsory for most families unless there's some reason why you can get an exemption. Making people go through a process that could be painful and difficult for them to access justice is wrong. It is just wrong. By having a compulsory FDR process, it relies on women who have the support that they need to speak up about domestic abuse in their relationships. Those women would be able to get an exemption and move straight through the court. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of women who are living in situations of serious family violence, who, because of that family violence, are too frightened to speak out when it comes to the court process. And they will not reveal that violence to the registrar because of fears of what might happen afterwards. So those people will not get an exemption from the $1,000 or get an exemption from the dispute resolution process. And that means those women in the main, who are in situations of serious family violence, who are too frightened to say so, will not only have to pay, but will have to face their abuser in a personal dispute resolution process. Not only that, this legislation will make it much more difficult for parties in this process to get access to legal support. So, in a situation, and there are thousands of these in New Zealand, where a woman is living in a situation of family violence, has very few economic resources as part of that relationship, has to go and is wanting to go and resolve some of these issues, is too frightened to say so, doesn't have the money to afford a lawyer to prepare for her legal argument that she can take either through the dispute resolution process or through the court. She is left out in the cold. She has nowhere to go. This system traps her out of justice. This is the system that is supposed to work for her and her kids. What does it do? It locks her out, because there's no understanding in the way that National has written this legislation on the family court, no understanding of that real lived life. Thousands of women in this country. Well, David Bennett is sneering, as he does when it comes to talking about women in vulnerable situations. But these women are showing up at the refuges every day.
Point of order, David Bennett. No, that's not a point of order. Materia Ture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These women are turning up to refuges every day. They are ringing up the helplines that might still exist after funding cuts every day, asking for help and support. And now the government is changing the family court system to make it even more difficult for them to get help, either through dispute resolution or through the family court, to establish their legal rights so that they can go forward and live a well life with their kids. This is a government who would rather take $1,000 from the poorest women in this country than provide them with real justice. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call Alfred Naro.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise to take a call on the family.